Hey everyone, welcome to this week's Azure Infrastructure Update. It is the 1st of May 2022. And as always, please go ahead and like and subscribe if you find this useful. As always, I do have the chapters below the video and in the description so you can quickly see what updates there are and maybe jump to one you care about more than others. I did manage to get a new video out. I actually pre-recorded it a week ago, all about Azure NetApp Files. So that's the Azure first-party service, but using the NetApp technology. A number of different tiers of service available to me. Really powerful service. I can get NFS, SMB, even dual protocol mounts of those volumes. So if you're interested in that, you can go and check out that video. So I am at least back home this week, unlike last week where I was in the hotel. And yes, I did finish Ironman Texas. So there was a little race report if you were really bored. But there's me being all happy where I did actually cross the finish line. And that white stuff is just salt that you're basically sweating out as you're doing the run. It actually went really well. I enjoyed it a lot, which was really nice. And so yes, I'm here this week. But then next week, I'm going to be back in a hotel when I record the Azure Update. So I'm doing the Ironman World Championship in St. George. It's my number 2617. Normally it's Kona. Because of COVID, it was pushed back a couple of years and now they're doing it in St. George. So yes, next week I'll be back on the road and taking part in that. But then it'll just be back to normal. Multiple videos every week, etc., etc. And St. George is horrible. The bike course is, like 7,000 feet of elevation gain. So we'll see how that goes. On to the new features. So on the compute side, Azure Container Apps. Remember, the whole point of Container Apps is, yes, I could use Kubernetes in Azure. I can use Azure Kubernetes Service for a managed Kubernetes environment, then deploy my manifest, but I have to understand still elements of Kubernetes, manage aspects of it. What Azure Container Apps do is they abstract away even the AKS. It gives me the ability to have event-driven auto-scaling. It gives me Dapper, it makes it easier for me to create my microservices. And now what I can do is there's certain built-in authentications. If it's an OpenID Connect compatible IDP, I can, with no or very minimal code, just go and hook into that. If it's Azure ID, if it's GitHub, if it's Twitter, my applications can now very easily use that for my in-app authentication. AKS now has group managed service account support. This is for Windows nodes. My node pools are made up of nodes that run a certain operating system, Linux or Windows. If I'm running Windows, I can now take advantage of this. So Windows has had managed service accounts for a long time. This was, hey, I need an account to run a service under, but I didn't want to worry about the password or rotating the password. So managed service accounts solved that. Group managed service accounts took that to another level, and I could now have that same account used across multiple nodes, useful for many kind of farm scenarios, multiple servers making up some cluster. Well, now I can integrate that in with AKS. Now, my nodes will have to be obviously Windows machines. They have to join my Active Directory domain, but then it's going to take care of all of the management of that, and I can use it for the authentication with my resources. AKS node pool snapshot. If I think about a node pool, we have a number of different elements to it. I can think about, well, there's a certain node image. This updates weekly. There's a certain Kubernetes version. And if I deploy a new node pool, if I deploy a new cluster, it will by default just take the new node image version. Or maybe I want some more assurance that it's going to stay consistent with existing node pools, with existing clusters. So I can take a node pool snapshot and then use that to create new node pools or a new cluster, and it will be created using those same node image versions, the same version of Kubernetes for the node pool from which I took the node pool snapshot. Providing they're still supported, there's certain support windows, now I can guarantee that consistency. AKS now has a scaled down mode. One of the huge benefits of the cloud is it's consumption-based. I pay for what I'm using. So if I think about in a Kubernetes environment and the managed Kubernetes with AKS, there's auto scale I might do at the pod level based on the work the pods are doing, add pods, remove pods. But then based on the scheduler's ability to schedule pods, i.e. is there space available, it might add nodes to a node pool and likewise remove nodes from a node pool. Now when it removes them, by default, it deletes them. It deletes the VMs that were providing that node functionality. Well, now I have an option to do deallocate instead of delete. So deallocate would stop the compute, so I stop paying for it, but it wouldn't delete the storage. And why that might be useful is one of the things the nodes have to do is cache the images for the containers that are running within the pods. So if I delete a node and then create a new one, it has to go and recache that content. But if I use the deallocate instead, I'm still going to pay for the storage. So I can't use ephemeral disks. I can't just use the local storage of the node because that VM won't exist on the node anymore. So it's going to have to use non-ephemeral storage. So it's using a managed disk, but it wouldn't delete the disk, so I still pay for it. But then when it starts the VM again, well, the image is already cached there. So it's going to get up and running and doing things faster. So you have that choice. Do I want to deallocate or do I want to delete? Static web apps now have GitLab and Bitbucket support for as part of the CI/CD pipelines. If I think about the static web app is fantastic for that pre-rendered content, one of the nice things it does is it integrates with various repos. Well, now that source for my application could be in GitLab or Bitbucket in addition to the existing Azure DevOps, GitHub, etc. So now I make a change to my application that's in one of those, and it will automatically get pushed through the pipeline and deployed out into my Azure Static Web App. Azure Functions now have PowerShell 7.2 support in preview. And then Azure Files now works with Windows App Service. This is the idea that if I am using a Windows-based app service, remember Azure Files gives me, for example, an SMB-based file share, I can mount that file share as part of my Windows application. So now the application can see the file share, it can use the content on it. Maybe it's using it because it needs some shared storage area. Maybe it's using it because I need some persistent storage. Maybe it's just using it as a store for images or HTML files, whatever it might be, I can now very simply integrate with Azure Files. On the networking side, I can now block domain fronting for a number of services like Azure Firewall, the Azure CDN. And the whole idea here is domain fronting is there's different ways to say what is the node, the name I'm talking to. There's something called SNI, server name indication. And I can say, hey, this is the domain name that I'm talking to. Well, I can make that different from the actual host name that's part of the HTTP host header. So SNI is in the TLS header. It's useful if maybe, hey, I've got multiple different domain names being hosted from the same IP. And I need the right certificate to match to it, so I can use SNI. But it can also be used for bad things. I might try and cloak the domain I'm trying to talk to by putting this fronting name in the SNI. I'm essentially hiding what I'm really talking to. Maybe I'm trying to bypass certain controls that exist. So what I can now do is I can raise a support ticket and they can disable, so they can block that domain fronting so it would get rejected if they don't match. Lots of database updates. So the Azure Managed Instance for Apache Cassandra has some updates. It's got Cassandra 4 support. There's things like Cassandra node tool commands can be executed via the Azure CLI. So really just bringing enhanced capabilities to that managed Cassandra offering that I can run in Azure. pgBouncer 1.17 is now GA for Postgres Hyperscale. Remember, Postgres Hyperscale is the Citus-based offering where it shards the data over multiple instances in those distributed tables. And I've referenced tables for data I need everywhere. Well, the pgBouncer is really useful for that connection pooling. There's a finite number of connections I can have to the database. So now instead of me trying to think, oh, someone gets disconnected or it fails, well, now I connect to the connection manager. It's going to enable me to reuse connections more efficiently and just streamline all of those interactions. And so the pgBouncer is native to it, so I don't have to go and deploy my own. So now it's version 1.17. MySQL Flexible now supports some of the higher burstable SKUs. The flexible offerings of the managed databases, remember, are VM-based. Benefits here is I can stop and start them. I can do things like automatic failover, high availability, but I can also use those B series, the burstable VMs. That's where, well, I actually only get provisioned maybe 10% of a CPU, but if I'm using less than that 10%, I start to accrue credit, just like a cell phone plan if I carry over minutes. Well, then if I need to, I can burst above that provision 10%. I go up to 100% based on the credits I've accrued. So I can run out a higher number, essentially for a cheaper virtual machine. Well, now it's supporting some of the higher, bigger virtual core SKUs of the B series. The 4, 8, 12, 16, and 20 core SKUs can now all be used with MySQL flexible instance. Azure SQL Database Hyperscale, so again, the big scale database, we're separating out the page servers, so very large scale. The point in time restore that used to be, I think, 1 to 7 days is now 1 to 35 days. So I can keep more of those short-term snapshots online, so I can restore from a further range back very easily. Obviously, I pay for the delta for the changes made, so it might cost me a bit more money. But if I want to do that, that's very easy now to do based on the logs that it has to store. Azure SQL Database has change tracking gone GA. So change tracking is something I turn on at the database level. So I turn on the change data capture at the database, and then on the tables, I can go and enable this change tracking. And what it's going to do is the insert, the update, the delete activity. It will now store and track those changes into change tables. Now what I can do with that is now I have the data in those change tables, I can trigger off of that. Maybe it's just I'm auditing, I want to go back and review what's happening. Maybe I've got some export, transform, extract, transform, load job, an ETL job that's going to trigger off of the various things that are happening. Maybe I'm just going to trigger off certain events I see in there to perform something else. But whatever the reason, we now have that available in GA for Azure SQL Database. And then Azure SQL Database storage limits have increased for some of the SKUs. So for selected compute sizes, the size of the database has increased from 1.5 to 2 terabytes. This applies for the single database, for Elastic Pool, both general purpose and business critical. And this now applies to the 8 and 10 vCore SKUs. Miscellaneous. So the Azure Compute Gallery Community Gallery is in preview. I can now create a gallery resource in Azure once I've signed up for this preview. I can then put my images in it. Maybe I do a nightly build. Maybe it's something I want to make available. I can then make this available to my customers who can then consume the images within their subscriptions. I do have role-based access control. It is a resource in Azure, so I can control it. And I'm typically going to do that at the gallery level. But it's just a way now I can share things between subscriptions without having to worry about, I don't want to publish to the marketplace or something else. I can now just go and create this gallery and make it available to other people. Azure Key Vault Automated Key Rotation is GA. So this is huge. If you look at many customer managed key services, for example, well, you're responsible for rotating the key. I have to go in, hey, generate new key. Many services don't require a version to be specified of the key it's using. It will go and detect when there's a new version. So now what I can do is through policy, I can automatically rotate those keys. I can even have expiry notifications by integrating with Event Grid to go and tell things when there's a new version of the key. So rather than me now having to remember every 30 days, okay, go and rotate that key, I create the policy, it will auto-rotate it. If there's some service, maybe like a storage where I'm using custom managed key, it can just go and detect automatically there's a new version and we'll start using it. If it doesn't do that automatically, hey, I can use the Event Grid integration and see that expiry notification and write something to go and say, hey, now go and use this new version. It could be my own application, whatever that is, it can now take care of that important rotation of the key. And then Azure Active Directory B2B Direct Connect is in preview. This maybe isn't what you think at first. This is not the tenant friending of old that we may have heard about. But it is the idea of creating this mutual trust between two Azure AD tenants, so I don't have to add users from one tenant as guests in the other tenant. But it's only going to be used today for things like Teams shared community. So I've got those Teams shared channels. That is the only feature that today will use this. But it lets me go in and create via the cross-tenant access settings to say, hey, inbound and then outbound, I want to enable this B2B Direct Connect, and then users from those organizations can consume the resources without actually having to be added as a guest user. So if I go to external identities, cross-tenant access settings, if I was just to look at someone, I've got inbound access and outbound access, what we'll see now is we have this B2B Direct Connect. And this is where I can now go in and I would set this up again. It's mutual kind of trust I would set up, but I could go and customize and allow access, for example. And I could even scope it to certain users and groups. So now for those Teams shared channels, I wouldn't have to go and add these people as guests to my tenant. They would now just be able to go and consume those things. So that's kind of a first step in this. Who knows where it's going to end up going, but that B2B Direct Connect is now in preview. And that's it for this week. So as always, I hope this is useful. Again, next week, we'll be back in a hotel. I'll do the best I can to bring you the updates. But until then, take care.